Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining me for my regular Washington update. We're doing it a little bit earlier this week, and boy, what a difference a week makes. At the end of last week, when I came before you, I was celebrating three huge wins from my policy agenda: the passage and signage into law of the FISA bill, Section 702, which was a reform bill, but still allowed America to surveil those terrorists and foreign agents that are abroad, something that's absolutely critical to our intelligence community. I also celebrated last week the president signing into law the legislation that will require the divestiture of TikTok from its Chinese control. I think TikTok has a lot of creativity, but the fact that at the end of the day it is I believe indirectly controlled by the Chinese Communist Party poses a national security threat that I and every other leader of the law enforcement and intelligence community have indicated. And then we also celebrated the long overdue but critical aid to Ukraine, as well as the assistance to Israel and humanitarian aid to folks in Gaza and additional assistance to Taiwan. So I thought I might be able to glide on that for a few more days, but the reality of other things in the job are coming at us fast and furious. Let me hit two topics on the top, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. First is yesterday, Senator Kaine, Congresswoman McClellan, and Congressman Whitman and I met with Postmaster General DeJoy about the situation in Richmond in terms of mail delivery and the fact of what has really been just totally unacceptable. For me, it was a little bit of a movie I'd seen previously. I recall a few years back when we had similar challenges, although more around staffing in Charlottesville, and it took repeated visits before we finally got to at least some level of correction. Before I speak to Richmond directly, let me, though, acknowledge the Postal Service across the board is facing a crisis. We have seen dramatic decline of first-class mail delivery as more and more people communicate online. We have a postal service that, frankly, was built for a different kind of mail delivery system. And candidly, there had been a dramatic underinvestment in upgrading of technology across the whole country. Unfortunately, the Postal Service chose Richmond for its, and let me just apologize here, I want to make sure I get the term for the program right, chose Richmond for the implementation of its new Delivery for America project. This is an effort to try to cut down particularly some of the transportation costs, was also to upgrade with conveyors across these new distribution centers, and frankly cut back the amount of fact where you've got a truck going from one part of the region to another, oftentimes without enough mail. I guess the good news of yesterday's meeting was the Postal Service and the Postmaster General agreed that the rollout in Richmond was a disaster. It was a mess, and it needs to be corrected. We have seen part of this problem was not only the implementation of this new initiative, but also something that I'm not sure had been made fully aware, that there had been a bankruptcy of both in Washington and Atlanta of contractors who did part of the kind of some of the back office operation. That led during the real height of the crisis between December and February, it exacerbated the decline. We have seen some recovery. It's still not where it needs to be. Folks in the Richmond region need to be able to know that if they mail something, it will be delivered on time, it will be delivered safely, and that people who, from paying their bills to, as we think about the primary season fast approaching in Virginia in June, there's an awful lot of voters that their only way they can get their ballots counted is through the mail service, and we've got to have a dependable mail service. The Postmaster General personally committed that this problem is going to be fixed and that Richmond is going to end up being the example for the rest of the nation. in terms of this new, more efficient delivery system. It's our intent to hold his feet to the fire, though. We're going to meeting with him again in 60 days. What I've found in the past is this is going to require constant attention from the congressional delegation. It's obviously bipartisan. We all depend upon the mail, and the folks in the greater Richmond area deserve better. I should also say that this was exacerbated, and while I can't get into the details of an ongoing criminal investigation, it was exacerbated by actually some criminal behavior taking place, and those that have been accused have been removed from their positions. So I feel like we've got the Postmaster General and the senior level of the Postal Service's attention. We're going to stay on this. We'll have more to report, but we are going to, again, as a delegation, be meeting again with the Postmaster General in 60 days. But in the interim, we're going to be getting regular updates on the level of delivery. The other thing that we just need to have, at the end of the day, people have to have confidence in the Postal Service, and that confidence is only going to be restored as well as if our constituents can feel that they have a chance to interact with leadership from the Postal Service so they can have their complaints heard by postal officials. And we'll have more to announce on that front in the next few days. So I think what was clearly a crisis, there was acknowledgement that it was a crisis. I believe we're on the path to being fixed. But to quote Ronald Reagan, trust but verify, and we were going to be continuing to verify this, ending up with another meeting with the Postmaster General within the next 60 days. Issue number one. Issue number two is something that I was hoping I'd be able to come before you today and indicate that we'd reached some level of compromise, and this is on the FAA reauthorization bill. It is necessary for us to get a FAA reauthorization, but unfortunately, the deal that was cut by the committees in both the House and the Senate, which included no one from the greater capital area, include 5 new slots, or a total of 5 new flights coming and going international. I think this is a potential safety disaster, as we saw literally 2 weeks ago, a near miss at National. The runway at National is already the busiest in the whole country, busier than anything out of Atlanta, busier than anything out of Chicago O'Hare, busier than any runway in the New York market. Adding these additional flights will both cause, I believe, a safety challenge and increased delays. Already at National Airport, over 20% of the flights are delayed, with an average delay time of over an hour, 67 minutes. The FAA has acknowledged adding this additional flights at National will increase those delays, and has been mentioned literally in testimony this morning. Secretary of Transportation Buttigieg, testifying before the House, said this would put additional pressure, these additional flights. We think this is both not safe for the traveling public. We don't think it is good for the traveling public to experience these level of delays. I think it also is Congress micromanaging, sometimes for individual members' convenience. An agreement that was literally been in place for 50 years to try to set the balance between National Airport and the more long-haul and international traffic that happens at Dulles and at BWI. That's why Senator Kaine and I and the Maryland senators, Senator Van Hollen and Cardin, are united in trying to change this. We'll take this fight to the floor of the Senate, and I think when people fully understand what this will mean, both in terms of traveling delays and safety, that we can hopefully change this bill to bring it back to where the House bill was. And I don't often agree with the House, but the House litigated this, even though the leadership of the House committees were going to include some additional flights, additional slots as they're called. The House actually rejected that in a full amendment basis. We hope to be able to do the same on the floor of the Senate. I know there are a host of other issues, but I know we've got a full House today. So, Laura, why don't I go to you and start taking questions?
Hey, Senator Warner, I've got 2 questions about TikTok. The first one is, just kind of talk about after ByteDance kind of announced this weekend they don't plan on selling, what's the next steps on when this ban could go into place? And the U.S. isn't the first country to ban TikTok as well. I mean, India. So, I mean, what's kind of been y'all's decision on why this needed to happen?
Well, first of all, I'm not surprised that ByteDance's opening position would be they don't want to sell. I think that may just be a negotiating stance. Time will tell. We did extend the time period from 6 months to a year because this is a complicated decision. And I actually call upon the close to 40% of the ByteDance ownership that are Americans to do the right thing, to stand up for national security, to make sure that Americans, 170 million of which use TikTok, that their data is safe. So far, no matter what promises are made by ByteDance, we have TikTok employees who leave TikTok who indicate the data is not safe. We also know that TikTok, with 170 million Americans, many young people getting almost all their news from TikTok, this is a propaganda tool that could potentially be more powerful than Fox News and MSNBC combined. And Lord knows we have enough differences amongst Americans that we don't need outside foreign governments that are adversarial to us trying to influence our elections or trying to pit us against one another. And as you mentioned, this is other nation states have taken this on. India has banned the use of TikTok starting in 2020. If you look at Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain, the European Union, they've all banned TikTok from governmental use. Large news media organizations like the British Broadcasting Company have said to their journalists, hey, be careful, don't use TikTok because the Chinese spy services may very well be surveilling you as journalists. And we've seen, again, in the public domain, evidence of this, or have been reported evidence of journalists being surveilled. So I think this is the smart thing to do. And again, what's ironic is the Chinese government themselves have been lobbying against this legislation. There's been reports of that. Why? Because I think they realize this is can be used as a tool for Chinese government purposes. And remember, China does not even allow the TikTok that our kids see allowed in China. They have a sanitized version of TikTok that only talks about studying hard and doing the right thing, very different than what we see. And I would remind viewers as well that Facebook, YouTube are not allowed in China. And let me also quickly say we need guardrails on American social media companies as well, but I'm glad we took this first step. I think there will be a divestiture. I think the creativity and the people who enjoy TikTok, that it will be divested to a new entity, and it doesn't have to be an American company. It can be, Canadian-owned, Brazilian-owned, French-owned. It just needs to not be controlled by an adversarial regime that's authoritarian. And I think that kind of creativity will be able to be continued. And by giving a full year timeline, I think that will allow a transaction to take place. I know there are groups of investors, have been a couple that have been public. I imagine others will come about. But this whole process would be a lot easier if the American investors themselves would stand up and do the right thing and say, hey, we agree at the end of the day for Americans' data to be safe and to make sure that that we don't have foreign propaganda manipulating Americans, that there ought to be a different ownership structure.
Senator, our next question is... Sorry, Andrew, we have to move on. We've got a lot of people in the queue today. Our next question is Mitchell Miller with WTOP.
Hi, Senator. Thanks, as always, for joining us. I have a question in connection with the Middle East. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today renewed his vow to launch an offensive into Rafah with or without a hostage deal. And I'm wondering what your concerns are about things moving forward with Israel, and do you worry that an offensive on Rafah could cause protests to intensify here at U.S. campuses?
Mitchell, thank you for the question. First of all, I agree with the Biden administration that there should not be an offensive in Rafah until and unless the Israeli government can show how the close to 1.5 million Palestinians that are in that section of Gaza can be kept some level of safe. Israel has a right to defend itself. The horrific tragedy of October 7th is, I know, still fresh on the minds of Israelis. But we've also seen 34,000 Palestinians killed, and a massive offensive in Rafah where more innocent civilians are wounded or killed is just not acceptable. And what I implore our friends in Israel to remember is that as we saw a couple weeks ago when Iran launched a massive missile strike against Israel, that missile strike was unsuccessful. It was unsuccessful because of Israeli activity, of American assistance, but also assistance from the British, the French, the Jordanians, and the Saudis. Israel is stronger when they have strong alliances. That support, particularly from Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and potentially even from Britain and France, will disappear if the Israeli government takes this kind of action without protecting innocent Palestinians. And my hope, and I think finally the Israeli government has moved more aggressively on the hostage negotiations. I think we need a ceasefire. We need, I think, and we will find literally in the next day or so whether Hamas accepts the terms of a deal that I think are fair. And I do commend the Israelis for moving on that. We need this hostage deal to get those families returned. We saw the video of Hirsch Polen, who was his family were Virginia residents before they moved to Israel. This is the young man who lost his son, and I've been very close with the family since October 7th. Their son needs to come home. That's only going to happen if there's a hostage deal. If that takes place, I think we would see a dramatic lowering of tensions. We would have a ceasefire, and I think that would also diffuse some of the protests that have taken place on campuses across the country and across Virginia. And let me address that. Let me be clear at the outset. While I absolutely support the First Amendment right to protest peacefully, we have to acknowledge there is enormous pain and angst on a lot of these campuses. There is no place on American campuses for anti-Semitism or anti-Islamic rhetoric or beliefs. And we see on campuses across America where Jewish students don't feel safe, where Muslim students don't feel safe, where there is, appropriate angst about the death and destruction on both sides that's taking place in the conflict in Gaza. But I also believe it is the responsibility, and I believe that it is the responsibility of the universities to make sure that that peaceful right to protest continued is one of the hallmarks of our nation. But I also feel like there are laws, and when laws are broken, the law needs to be enforced. And what I've been trying to do, and listen, there have been protests on college campuses literally since I've been born. I was in the 60s. I was in middle school, but I still remember when colleges were shut down around the Vietnam War with protests in 1968, and we've seen protests around, literally dozens of other issues over the last 60 plus years. What is different about some of these protests, and I'm trying to do my own due diligence on this, is when the protesters literally set up encampments on university grounds. And I think most universities have rules against trying to bring permanent or semi-permanent encampments onto college campuses. That seems to be, once these encampments take place, I've yet to see any of them that don't end then in some level of conflict. And I think we need to try to do all we can to avoid that conflict. And frankly, Mitchell, the most important thing we could do to lower this temperature is to see if we could get this hostage deal, see if we could get a ceasefire, and try to bring about reconciliation. I can tell you, as somebody who was in Saudi Arabia in January, Saudi Arabia will never recognize Israel and try to help bring greater peace to the Middle East, and until this conflict will end. So it is in Israel's best interest as well to go the extra mile, both on the hostage deal and trying to bring this conflict in Gaza to an end.
Senator,
Thank you very much.
Our next question is Margaret Barthel with WAMU.
Hi, thanks, Senator. I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit about, the timeline and the strategy for for defeating these new slot and perimeter rules for national airports.
Well, remember, in the past we've reached some level of accommodation, and there have been a few extra slots added every few years. We're now at the point where the FAA and the Transportation Secretary have said further volume on the most busy runway in America will cause both extra delays, and as the Transportation Secretary says today, put additional stress. And unfortunately, we've seen that stress. I think an example of that where we had a near miss take place that was recorded 2 weeks ago. I hope we are able to share that recording with all of our colleagues. So we've got a strategy both on an amendment to the legislation. We still are having conversations with the leaders of the Commerce Committee in the House and the Senate. We've been in contact with our colleagues in the House. And remember, I know there are members out west that might get them easier trip to come to work. But as you see these additional Western flights added, a lot of the flights that will be then taken away will be in markets east of the Mississippi. That's why so many, this doesn't break down Democrat, Republican, so many other senators who are afraid that they could see, a diminishment of flights to Nashville or flights to Charleston, South Carolina, or flights to Little Rock, Arkansas, and those who are in some of the United hubs in Denver and Chicago and Newark, I think will join with us to say, for safety, for not putting additional delays at national, and for just honoring what has been now a 60-year agreement between Dulles, National, and BWI, Congress ought to not be sticking its nose in this. And so we'll take the amendment path, and then we've got a few other tools that we can bring to the process if need be.
Senator, our next question is Tom Fitzgerald with Fox 5. Tom? Okay, we're going to move on to Elizabeth Holmes with WTVR.
Hey there, Senator Warner. I just had a question about mail, that's happening in Richmond. You mentioned some criminal behavior. Wanted to see if you might be able to share if this is happening inside the distribution center, and also if you and Mr. DeJoy talked about any kind of crime happening outside of the distribution center, people breaking into mail carrier trucks. I think we've had several reports of that in Richmond, so wanted to see where that stood as well.
Sure. We spent, with Postmaster DeJoy, we did press him a bit on some of the reported criminal activity that took place in one of the installations. He obviously couldn't talk about an active criminal investigation. I can't comment on that, but some of the accused have been removed. Number one, we didn't get a specific answer on the reports of mail trucks themselves, but we will go back. I'll have my staff go back on that item right now. I do think, again, this was the first place where this reform took place, and I think Richmond was chosen because as a distribution center, it was smaller. I think the Post Service did a disservice without warning both the Richmond customer base and, frankly, doing a good enough job of training the Richmond employees about these new processes and procedures. I do think if this reform is successfully implemented, we will see better service. And listen, I was back in 2020 when Mr. DeJoy was first appointed. I had real suspicions about him. I raised holy heck about him. We've got a whole new Postal Service board that was appointed by President Biden. And candidly, they have said that DeJoy, they've voted confidence in DeJoy. I think he has trying to get his arms around what has been a operation that has not been updated in many ways for 20, 30, 40 years with both technology, and you've got at this point a declining revenue source of first-class mail. And one of the things that in this part of the business process I think has changed, and I think it's necessary. The ironic circumstance is that if you think of UPS and FedEx, who've got high efficiency rates, what they do is they still rely on the Postal Service oftentimes to deliver that last mile or 5 miles for really remote locations. And the Postal Service was frankly not charging a fair rate, and they were taking a hit on that, and UPS and FedEx at the same time were then in effect taking business away from the Postal Service that indirectly the Postal Service was subsidized. That makes, as a former business guy, that makes no sense. So I think we are going to have to go through this transition. I was happy to see I didn't hear excuses from the Postmaster General. He acknowledged they screwed up, that it was a mess, that consumers weren't informed, and that the postal workers themselves were not adequately trained. He said that he wants to make this the best distribution center in the country, and we're going to hold him to that. And Tim and Jen and Rob and I and the balance of the delegation, we're going to stay on this. I can tell you and this was a more complicated process than what we had in Charlottesville a few years back. That was more just a staffing problem because, let's face it, in many cases for opening salaries, it was easier for Chick-fil-A to hire people than the Postal Service. Now, if you stay at the Postal Service for a year, you end up starting to accrue benefits and other things that makes it a good career. But for that initial hire, Postal Service jobs are just not as competitive as they should be. But I think we all came away with the sense that there was a recognition that the rollout had been poorly executed, that there is efforts to try to improve, and we're going to stick on this. And and part of this as well, we stressed is that you got to keep the confidence of your consumers. And when there was this stiff arming of not having the Postal Service even be willing to listen to consumer complaints, that undermines confidence. You undermine confidence, then less people use the mail. Less people use the mail means less revenue, and that means the fiscal hole the post office is in goes down even worse. So I think we came away with a commitment to fix this, but I think we came away with the commitment as well that the Postal Service needs to be more forward-leaning with folks in the greater Richmond area about how why these changes are coming about, and when they can start to see some improvement in service.
Senator, our next question is Jad Khalil with Virginia Public Media.
Hi, Senator. Thanks for taking our questions. Some of your colleagues in the Democratic Party here in Virginia have condemned some of the use of force by police in dispersing these protests on campuses. So I wanted to ask if you thought that the level of force that some of these law enforcement agencies are using is appropriate.
Listen, I think you have to look at these on an individual basis. I mean, I met with some of the VCU leadership this morning. I've got more questions that I need to get answered in terms of the ratio of VCU law enforcement, city law enforcement, state police law enforcement. So I'm not going to make some kind of blanket statement. I come back to where I start. There are communities across our country, and particularly on college campuses, where there is real pain and angst, and while there is a right of free speech and protest, I don't believe there are spots on our campuses where virulent anti-Semitism or virulent anti-Muslim feelings should be allowed. I think that at some point that speech goes beyond the boundaries of protected free speech. I hope as well that within those set of rules, though, if you break the law, there needs to be consequences. I mean, I saw the breakage of some of the windows and buildings at Columbia University. Candidly, that reminded me of other times when protesters have tried to take the law in their own hands. I would condemn that. I condemn this kind of breaking of the law. And I do worry about the notion of these encampments in terms of, I know on some universities they've said, well, maybe folks will just peacefully disband them. I don't think that has proven to be the case yet. So I'm going to, again, try to take these on an individual basis. I do hope everyone, though, if you do have overreaction from law enforcement, that sometimes can spiral the level of violence and actually, rather than cutting down or on protests, actually leads to spread of the protests. So this is a real-time activity. My hope is that the college presidents and administrations will be communicating with each other and try to show appropriate restraint. But again, when the law is broken, there needs to be consequences.
Senator, our next question is Alyssa Ranker with Wavy.
Hi, thank you, Senator. In light of 13 people, including 6 students being arrested at protests at VCU last night, where is the line between First Amendment rights and public safety with these protests at Commonwealth universities?
Well, listen, I am more accepting of when a student body itself is protesting. But as we see even from the VCU example, when over half of the folks that were arrested were non-students, that concerns me. I mean, 14 law enforcement officers were also hurt in the protest last night. I think there are additional protections for students rather than, and whether those full set of protections fully extend to, there's a set of rules you agree to as a student. Sometimes if you're coming in from the outside, whether all of those, I think that raises a different set of issues. I'm going to, again, though, look at these on an individual basis. There is a right to protest. There are rightful and understandable concerns about the war in Gaza and the 34,000 Palestinians that have been killed and the 2,500 plus Israelis that were brutally murdered on October 7th. I want there to be protests. I want there to be allowed to be protests. But I also feel like when those protests interfere with the right of students to get an education, particularly as we go into exam week, that pushes the edge. And again, I'm going to come back to what I've been saying. You got a right to protest, but if you break the law, there are consequences. And particularly if you see, as in the case of VCU, the majority of the folks who were arrested were not even students, that raises an issue of concern to me.
Senator, our next question is Brittany Slaughter with ABC 13. Brittany? Okay, we're going to move on to Heather Hope with WRIC.
Hey, Senator, I know you touched a lot on the Gaza-Israel situation at VCU, but more specifically, like you mentioned, is it necessary for the riot gear from police officers as we come into what could be another night of protesting tonight? If we had 13 arrested last night, we don't know what tonight could unfold. What's your message to the community as these tensions continue to rise?
My message is, I'm doing all I can, and I know our CIA director has been dispatched again to the Middle East to see if we can get this hostage deal that would bring about a ceasefire in Gaza. That would be the best thing for Israel, best thing for Palestinians, and the best thing to lower the temperature on college campuses all across America. As I said, I've got some unanswered questions. that I posed to VCU's leadership this morning. I want to get those questions answered. I do think there are additional rights for students. When you enter into a compact, my understanding at VCU that was when, at least the way they reported to me, and this is where I want to get verification, that when it was students only during the day, that they were both abiding by the rules around amplification of their speeches and adhered to the university principles that have been set up. So again, I think you've got a right to protest. But I also think as a student at VCU, or for that matter any other university, if you choose not to be part of the protest, you have a right to be able to go safely to classes and to be able to finish your exams in a safe and secure manner and not have those rights infringed on as well.
Senator, our final question is Adam Longo with WUSA 9.
Hi, Senator. Thank you. Just a quick question for you on the DCA slots. I'm wondering what your analysis is of why some of your congressional colleagues are so insistent to move forward with the additional slots. Do you believe it's a result of their own personal interest in wanting to be able to get in and out of Reagan National a little bit easier? Thank you.
I'm not going to cast aspersions on any individual member's travel needs, although historically, as you look as slots have been added, oftentimes it's been added or pushed for by senators who then end up benefiting from some of those additional slots. End of the day, we've said repeatedly, Congress shouldn't be micromanaging the air traffic at National, Dulles, and BWI. And why would we take the country's busiest runway? And I don't think there's not a runway. Look at LAX, look at Chicago O'Hare, look at Atlanta Hartsfield, look at the New York airports. No single runway is busier than the runway at National. And when we had auxiliary runways and we had a lot of those smaller commuter planes that could use those smaller runways, as we cut down that commuter traffic, everybody goes back to the main runway. So we saw a near miss a couple weeks ago in terms of a safety issue. We see already 20% of the flights delayed for an average of over an hour, 67 minutes. We've seen the FAA say these added slots will add, it was 875 minutes, I think, a day additional. And we've got the Transportation Secretary saying this morning in public testimony, this will put additional stress. I hope my colleagues will do the right thing for the traveling public's both on-time performance and safety needs and remove these unnecessary additional slots.
Senator, that was our final question.
Thanks so much, everybody. Be well.